Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Alec, and as always, I'm going to be here in the background to help answer any of your general or technical questions. But before we get started, I'd like to go over a few important things you need to know about the session today. There's no dial-in number for today's webinar. All audio will be streamed through your computer speakers or headphones, so please adjust your volume there accordingly. You can submit questions or any technical issues that may arise by clicking on the Q&A icon located on the right-hand side of your screen, labeled here with this top arrow. Click there, type in your question, and click submit. If it's content related, it may be pulled during the Q&A session at the end if time allows. And if it's a technical question, I'll have an answer for you that will appear on your screen shortly after you submit. You can also download a PDF to follow along with today's presentation by clicking on the handouts icon, also located on the right-hand side of your screen. Just click there, and you should be able to download a PDF to follow along. Today's webinar is being recorded. You're going to receive a link to the recording and a follow-up email. Along with the recording, you'll receive a link to the PDF and your HR, CI, and SHRM certification codes for today's webinar. All right, so with us today, we have Lori Niles-Hoffman, the Director of Digital Learning at Scotiabank. Lori is a Senior Learning Advisor with 15 years of global experience in industries ranging from finance, consulting, and marketing, and she has led through the L&D alphabet, starting with the old CD-ROMs up to the LMS and onward to AR and VR. So it is our pleasure to have Lori with us. So without any further delay, Lori, let's get started.
Thank you very much, Alec. Pleasure to be here, and a warm welcome to all of you who have decided to join in. I know we have a fairly full house, so I am going to try and leave a good amount of time for questions at the end. Likewise, my Twitter handle is Lori Niles. If you have anything that you want to ask that there isn't time for in this session, feel free to send it through on there, and I'll make sure that I get back to you before the end of the day. So we're going to talk about blended learning, and as I was putting this together, the theme that came to me is started thinking about coffee and the perfect blend. Right now, I'm very addicted to, anyone who knows me in Toronto, I'm very addicted to something called a cortado, which if you haven't had one, I would highly recommend. It's a perfect blend of espresso and steamed milk, and it was over a cortado I was actually starting to write this presentation. So let's take a look at some of the things that I've come across when we're talking about blended learning. So basically, I'm going to be going through 8 different themes, things that I like to keep in mind when I'm designing a blended learning curriculum. Some of these are going to seem obvious, and then I'm going to go into some things that are a little bit more complicated as we get into numbers 6 and 7, things that might challenge you a little bit to think about, but I do think they're worthwhile doing. So to start off, I think the basic thing for us to remember is that when it's about blended learning, it's not about us. And that seems obvious, and I know all of us are highly competent L&D professionals, and we're always considering our audience, but often we're not thinking about the actual audience experience. And we think that everybody's waiting for the content that we're providing, and that as soon as it appears in their inbox, they're going to go to it. And the fact is this isn't really how it works. So I use the analogy that, this is what we think the learner sees. They're hyper-focused on us, there's one lens, and that's the direction that they're looking at. But when it comes to L&D, I always say that our biggest competition is a Google search. They're one click away from going elsewhere. So we need to think about this blended learning experience in a way that we're competing in this type of environment. And this is what their environment looks like. It's people desperately trying to get their attention. You consider the average, what comes into people's inbox. It's going to be email, they're getting texts. There's also going to be pop-ups on their screen. Even their screensaver is something that's asking for their attention. So how do we fit in with that? How do we navigate in this environment in order to get a share of the attention? And that can be sometimes difficult for us to do. So consider the emails that you get in your inbox. Perfect example would be the ones that you're getting right now from CLO for this webinar. You'll notice that it has a catchy title, it has graphics, there's engagement that entices you to click and to have a look. Well, if we compare this, and this is my LMS, try and contain your excitement. So this is what somebody on our LMS would be getting typically as a notification. not the most exciting of things. As you can see here, it's really just, it's got the course number, because of course the learner really wants to know that. A few details. I find it interesting that it says the time zone is America, New York, when I'm located in Toronto, even though that is the same time zone. But it's not very engaging. So if we think back to that paparazzi shot of all the things that that person is being bombarded with, this feels like administration, something they kind of have to do. Now, I know that some of you are probably on different platforms where you're able to customize some of those emails, notifications. If you are on those, I would really urge you to have a look at those and see about what are some different ways you can title things, what are some graphics you can put into it to make that initial impression that that's going out is going to be something that they automatically want to click on. I like to use the example, think of, course descriptions, think of, Netflix and how they write their episode descriptions. That gets you to click on it and go and be engaged. And engaged doesn't mean just doing a drag and drop or something, an interactivity. Engaged means you're actually thinking about the content, digesting it, and contextualizing it. So that's the first thing, very basic. Moving on to the second, though, is when I talk to people about blended learning and what their thoughts are on blended, oftentimes, although it is shifting, they tend to think of it very black and white, that in that it's either classroom or e-learning modules. So there's the digital learning and the in-person learning. And I like to challenge back and say, perhaps e-learning modules are not the only fruit. They're not the only modality that is available to us. And again, thinking back to that paparazzi photo, everybody's taking a flash. Well, what if somebody waves a red flag? That captures attention in a different way. So what are some of the things that we need to think in addition to the e-learning module? And some of the things that I've been playing around with my team at Scotiabank is looking at other modalities, such as an article. People think that an article isn't learning. Articles are hugely consumed, and yet we don't often use it as modality. White papers are excellent. They're similar to the articles, but they're much longer format with some deeper information and knowledge sharing. Posters, we don't often think of that. That feels very much so like a marketing piece. But if you're in an office where you're able to do that, those are things to consider. And alongside of that, I look at infographics, podcasts, things that people can download, videos, interviews, transcribed interviews even, and social learning. And I'm going to talk more about social learning in a few slides, because I actually have some very specific things to say about that. But all of these are different from what we normally consider when we think about a blended learning campaign. And it's interesting because as I've grown out the team at Scotiabank, where I am right now, we've actually brought on different skill sets as we've expanded the team. One of the things that we brought in was somebody who is strictly a digital content writer. They come from a prominent magazine in Canada. And so they're able to, they actually don't have a learning background, but they partner with somebody who has those skills in order to write some of the digital content, like our video scripts, things like that. And that's been a very different way to engage. And we've actually had quite a few successes with that. We also have somebody with very highly toned graphic design skills. And we leverage those in things like posters and infographics. So it's a different way of looking at the structure. And in conjunction with this, as we look at some of these things outside of the e-learning, we're also considering what an average user's day looks like. So where are the places that they're likely to spend time? And I'll talk more about that. It's something that I call digital body language, and I'll leave to the end. But these pieces all can fit together to make that nice blended experience, because we all know that people are going to learn best when they are drip-fed content, not when it's just given to them on a fire hose, but when they get it in small increments that are repeatable and at a paced measure. So beyond e-learning, now the other question that we often get to consider is determining what content goes where. And this is a tricky one, because again, if we're thinking of the binary way of what goes into classroom, what goes into digital, this was the way I used to think of it, and I think most people in L&D used to think of it. And this was really a economics-driven perspective. So if we think of our Bloom's taxonomy, if it was locate, recall, understanding, any of those sort of foundational pieces, we put them into the digital format. And the rationale for that was, well, it's not as expensive to bring somebody into the classroom. I don't want to bring somebody into the classroom and pay for them to, use that time for them just to get the low cognitive scale. So that used to go by default into learning, into the e-learning or digital format. And then the other reason for that too is that everybody would come into the classroom at an even playing field, right? So everybody would have a base level of knowledge before they got into the classroom, and so they could all play in the same sandbox and be effective. I get it, and I agree with some of this to a certain extent, especially that you want to reserve your classroom for the higher cognitive levels. But my mind is starting to shift a little bit on this, and where it's gone to is a place that, and this is just a very, very simple blended matrix that I start to look at. And I start to look at the individual pieces and I look at, okay, what's the degree of change? How far is the distance between where the audience typically is operating now to where they need to go to reach the performance outcome of this particular learning? And then I also too look at the aptitude. So the aptitude is, how readily are they going to be able to do this? What is the skills gap? And I think that, some people will say that this is almost aptitude versus attitude. I still look at it in terms of degree of change, because I don't think you can also measure people's attitude, and it's our job as learning professionals to work with that. But when I start plotting some of the learning objectives or pieces, I start looking at where they appear on this matrix. And the things that tend to go to the top left, and that's a high skill gap and a high degree of change, those are the things I tend to put in the classroom. And the reason for that is because it's a way for a skill facilitator to be able to navigate through some of these trickier things. It also has some of the skills practice in there. They can ask questions, they can make mistakes, they can learn from their peers, and all of that. Yes, you can do it in e-learning, you could do it in any of the other digital formats, but you're getting the emotional part, and that's a big hurdle. So I tend to put those things into there. And again, I also find too that putting some of the digital pieces as pre-work, people don't often do the pre-work. So you have we're all limited in time. So there tends to be that gap by the time people get into the classroom. So you really run a risk of, your first day of classroom training not being effective because people aren't prepared for whatever reason. So this is the model that I'm moving a little bit more towards. But then I also too want to make sure that I've got stuff that is coming out post the event, et cetera, et cetera. So this is how I'm thinking about where that change is. Moving on, this is probably one that is an interesting one that I take a pretty firm position on. And what I mean by that is that I think social must have a strategy. So all of your learning assets generally have to sit somewhere, whether they're sitting on an LMS or if they're sitting on a social collaboration platform, or if you have any of those things, you need to be able to do something with them. And so I'll do a quick poll question. If I can throw it over to you, Alec. I'd like to know, do you have a learning community manager? Is that something that you have on your team? And we'll see here what some of the results are that come back. Are we getting some results coming in, Alec?
They're coming in. They're coming in a little slowly, so we'll give it a few more seconds.
Everyone needs a coffee. Or a cortado. Okay, so very, very interesting here. I'm seeing a very interesting blend. So 22% say yes. I think that's great. It is a great direction. 37% say no, completely get it. And that's because we typically in L&D, I know that we're already on skeleton staff. We're already being pulled in so many different directions that this is probably an extra headcount that we just don't have, or we're not going to be funded for. A lot of times too, I see that people just expect it to be part of everyone's already very busy jobs. Learning community manager, or what is a learning community manager? Well, I'll tell you what a learning community manager is. This is the role of somebody, if you have a social collaboration tool, and those could be any number of things. It could be, there's workplace, Facebook is one that you often see. It could be, Yammer is another one. And the community manager is somebody who keeps an eye on, first of all, the things that people are posting in their general communities of practice, and they try and make connections. So say if Paul is posting about Six Sigma as a methodology, that learning community manager would say, hey, we have a course on Six Sigma. Can I connect you with Emily, who is able to talk about, is an expert in Six Sigma? They're making those connections. They also, too, are the ones who are posting conversations. They seed conversations. They might post a question. They might post an article and say, what's the takeaway on this? Did you have any impressions? And then they respond and monitor those. And so they try and drive engagement with the content. So that's really the role of a learning community manager. And then poor 9%, I do not even have a learning collaboration tool, and I'm very, very sorry for you, because I know that it's a hard way to operate. If you don't have a learning collaboration tool or sort of a social platform, see what parameters there are in your organization to maybe look at some. Yammer is you can get for free if you're using it. You may even want to think about some Slack channels. I use Slack a lot within my network. And Slack is free up to the first 10,000 messages. You can do quite a bit with that. So there's things that you can consider. So we'll be brought back here to the slides, and thank you very much, Alec. So I see we've sort of got some people who are thinking in this this general area. But the thing about social is it's one thing to have it, and I believe in it, but we also need to be careful about it. And the reason I say, and this is a true example, not from where I'm employed right now, but a previous one where we brought everybody to a learning event, and everyone was thrilled. And I've changed the names to protect the innocent. And everybody went on, all the participants went on to the social collaboration site, and they were posting at the facilitator. So the facilitator, again, is not Megan Pollock, so don't go on LinkedIn searching for this poor person, because that's not their name. But they were like, excellent class, loved all the collaboration, loved the workshop, where can I find the extra materials, where can I download these things? Best workshop ever, I want to apply everything. Great. I mean, this is a type of engagement that we want to see. But when we looked at the facilitator's profile, this is what came up. They're not active. So all of that emotion, and there is emotion that is created in the classroom. When people go into a classroom, we know it's a vulnerable state for people. They're maybe with strangers. They have to admit that they don't know something, and they're there to test and learn and maybe make mistakes. And they do somewhat of a bond with a facilitator. So if you don't have that engagement happening, all of those people now are feeling probably very dejected and may not even apply some of the concepts because there is no response back, and there's nothing that is encouraging them to continue on and seed the dialogue and connect them together. So something I've been pretty firm about is if you are going to do social, you may not have a dedicated learning community manager. Again, I get it, we're all budget constrained, but you do need to have some sort of strategy, somebody looking at the pages for 15 minutes a day to make sure that there is some monitoring and engagement. So I like to look at it as this metaphor, which is basically social is a stethoscope, not a megaphone. You can't simply stand there and throw out all the articles and podcasts and videos and all that and expect people to like it, and then that's it. You need to have some way that you're listening carefully and looking at what people are doing, because they are actually telling you a lot, and you can help drive the engagement and the sustainment. Perfect example I observed at one company was the CEO actually had a blog, and the blog they would post regularly, and at first they got lots and lots of engagement, but the CEO never ever responded to comments or liked comments. And as time went on, there was less and less people even bothering to read it. And that's a bit scary. Meanwhile, we had somebody who was just junior, not junior, but meaning just new to the company, really excited. And they started their own blog. and they ended up having more followers than the CEO. And that was because she actively responded and engaged. She did that learning community management. So this is something I think we do need to start to look at. So keep this in your back pocket. Looking at number 5, for this one, I know. Make friends with comms, communications, and marketing for a number of reasons. And I know that in L&D, we're really tired of hearing we need to be like marketers. They're the ones with fidget spinners and big budgets. But we do need them because they do know how to engage with the very same people that we are trying to engage with. They're working in marketing and communications in particular. Marketing is external to customers, and you may be doing customer-facing training, but especially comms, they are trying to communicate. And they are one of the other paparazzi, just like us, with a flashbulb, trying to get that person's attention. And they do it in different ways. And so we have to pay attention and work sometimes together with them. And I totally get that they do not know things like we know about cognitive load and Bloom's taxonomy, but they do know about engagement. They also, too, have avenues of communication that we as L&D professionals actually don't often have access to, and that's something that I'm going to talk about when we get to number 7, which is actually something that you may even be able to do from a technical standpoint in collaboration with communications and marketing. But in the meantime, these are the types of things that I would look for. And notice I say ask nicely. The things that they can start to tell you, usually off of the top of their heads, like they will have this type of data readily available, would be most visited internal sites and pages. I'll talk a little bit later about why this is important, but they'll know where people are going. They'll know where the traffic is and where people are highly engaged and which pages really get no views. They also, too, will know something that's called open rate for emails. So, in your company, you probably have an email notification, or an email comes up, it's a newsletter, or it's, we want you to, register for the Christmas or holiday dinner, or, whatever it is. Open rate is whether somebody actually opens it or whether it just goes directly to the recycle bin. And believe it or not, they can tell that. And this is key information because when we know this, we can tell what type of headlines or topics are of interest to people. It's sneaky, but it works. The other thing that communications or marketing, it'll depend on what it's like in your company. They'll have access to things like other broadcasting messaging tools. So I mentioned here Screensaver. If you're able to do that, that is such a simple way for you to get some quick learning information out there that isn't, it may even just be an e-learning awareness piece, but it could also be too a piece of information that you want them to know. Say you're doing something about data privacy. You may have some things that come up that talk about some key information. I mean, that's quite effective rather than having that in a piece of e-learning, or you augment it in an e-learning. This kind of becomes like the virtual poster. There may be some other broadcast messaging tools they use. I know some people still use voicemail. I don't, but some people will still, you can do a broadcast message. You can do all these different things. But what happens is if you speak to marketing or communications, they'll be able to tell you what is the best one for your particular audience. What do people pay attention to? And I think finally, the one that's really, really critical are the names of influencers. They can tell you who are the people who are talking about their company a lot on LinkedIn, who are the people who are most active, who people listen to. These influencers, those are also people who maybe you want to have share one of your articles, or even say prompt people to register in one of your e-learning courses. And the reason for that is, think about Facebook and or any other social media that you use. We tend to trust things from people that we trust, and those are influencers in your network. So if, say, I'll use the example, say my mother shares something, I'm going to be automatically curious because she's my mother and I want to make sure it's not one of my embarrassing childhood photos. But she's in my sphere of influence. If I had somebody who's maybe like a second friend of somebody post something, I don't have that relationship with them. I don't know their values. I don't know their DNA. I don't know if we're aligned. I'm probably not going to pay as much attention to that. So you want to pay attention to who these influencers are and see if you can use them and leverage them to your advantage, getting them to share some of your messages. Number 6. follow the learner and meet them where they are. So I mentioned on the previous slide about understanding the pages that people most often visit. Where do people go? I'm always interested when people start learning campaigns or they start trying to build something new. The first thing that they do is they say, okay, we're going to build a web page or we're going to build like another social collaboration site. I always caution against that because you now are effectively asking for two changes in behavior. You're asking them to now go to a new page and make that a daily or weekly or regular habit. And then you're also asking them to change the behavior that is inherently within the learning. So that might be adopting a new coaching model or new software, whatever it is. That's actually quite a huge cliff to climb for people, and it doesn't happen very often. So I'm a big believer in what I call following the learner and understanding their digital body language, because that way you're responding to them in kind. So here we have a quick little poll question, and Alec, if I could get you to open this up. I'm curious as to whether you track any of the following metrics. And if you do track any of them, select it. If you don't track any, just leave it blank. And we can see, I see we've got about 400 attendees, so I'll be able to tell roughly, what the percentages of people who are tracking any of these metrics.
They're slowly starting to come in again, Lori, so we'll give it a few more seconds and then we'll push the results.
Absolutely. And these numbers might be low, and that's okay. Okay, so we do have some people who are looking at, page traffic is the highest. I'm so happy to see that. Social collaboration, I am seeing this. Excellent, excellent. Mobile versus desktop. This is a really, really interesting one for me because I always look at mobile rates versus desktop because I find in some audiences, first of all, I believe in building mobile, so please don't quote me that Lori doesn't believe in mobile because that's not at all what I mean. What I mean is sometimes there's some barriers that people will not use mobile. For example, me being located in Canada, our data plans are extremely expensive. They're one of the highest in the world. If you're paying for your own data plan, that's a economic hurdle for somebody to do some learning on their mobile. So sometimes we don't build mobile learning for that reason. But so it's something to consider. So we don't often also automatically translate to having mobile. Time of day and day of week visits. Excellent to see some of these. Alec, am I able to know how many people responded, or is that not possible?
We don't have those specific numbers. Okay. We had around 40% of attendees answer that.
Okay, so that's excellent. That's excellent. That gives me a good benchmark. So there's some people. So I would say I'm going to do really rough math, but there's about a quarter of you who are starting to look at some of these things. Excellent. Thank you, Alec. So this is when I start introducing something that's quite critical, or I think quite interesting to look at, which is something I've been calling digital body language. And digital body language is looking at all of these things, such as time of day, mobile, every drop off, click, or share. This is a learner telling you their likes and dislikes. And if we think of when we were in the classroom, we used to be able to see what the audience was thinking about, just because they would eye roll, smile, arms crossed. Are they looking at their mobiles? What are they doing? So all of these things start to let us understand what the engagement levels are for content. And if you think of that blended learning and what that is all going to look like, we want to be able to put out things that we know people are going to engage with. So some of the things that you want to be looking at, if you aren't looking at them already, are downloads, drop-offs, time of day, which some of you are already doing, mobile versus desktop, likes, comments, shares, trends. All of these things, when you put them together, as you're planning your blended learning campaign, and I use the word campaign deliberately, you want to be looking at all these things and say, we did a video, we didn't get a lot of views of that, after the 2-minute mark, but wow, we got a lot of downloads of a white paper. What was it about that white paper that people liked? For our next campaign, let's think about another white paper. So start thinking of those things. Time of day, do I want to hit people at 9 in the morning because that's when they're most active? Think of these things, and you should plan your campaigns right down to these metrics. And as we go a little bit further in these metrics, we're going to talk about xAPI very briefly as a compass. So here's another little quick poll question. What is your experience with xAPI? I can spell xAPI. You have no idea what it is. I know what it is, haven't used it, and I use xAPI. This is not at all a trick question, because I know that this is something I'm actually asking this more out of curiosity and to see what the uptake is. So the poll is open. If you could take a moment to respond, and we can talk a little bit after that about how xAPI can be used. And here we go. 5% can spell xAPI. Yay! I have no idea what it is. Okay, 69% know what it is, but I haven't used it. And I use xAPI. 2%. Ah, that's pretty cool. That's excellent. Thank you very much for responding to that. So xAPI in a really simple format is essentially a piece of code, and I should have built a slide on this, but it's a piece of code that you can use to track with more granularity how people are engaging with your learning. That's one way you can do it. You can also find things that track the way people are accessing learning, different pieces of learning outside of your LMS, and then feed that back to your learning record store. That is such a high level, and you would really need a whole webinar on it, so forgive me for going through that. But if you haven't, and if you are curious about xAPI, I would have a look at Megan Torrance. She runs an xAPI bootcamp. It's free, and there's some excellent stuff there. If you're interested in that, I can tweet about it if you follow me, and let you know what's happening there. And again, it's free. It's a really fun bootcamp. Some great people are there. But in a nutshell, what you can get is I was talking about all those other types of data points that we can look at, the shares and the drop-offs versus the desktop and all that. But you now can get a few more interesting things with xAPI. So you can look at things like how long does a person spend on a page, how far did they scroll, and in particular, what path did they take through learning? I heard an amazing case study. A woman was using Cornerstone OnDemand, who is the sponsor of this webinar. Thank you. And they actually put Google Analytics on top of their CSOD platform or instance, and they were able to see how people went through it. Now, you may say, well, that's interesting, and it is, but think again of that campaign, all of that data, and when you start seeing that how they basically flow through, you want to then design backwards to that so that you get the maximum engagement, because you're going where the people are already going. You're responding to their digital body language. So there's just such a lot of things you can do. But again, xAPI, I'm not the expert in it. There's lots of people who are. I'll make sure that I tweet some best examples and places you can go along with Megan Torrance. But it's definitely something I think that needs to be on everybody's radar. Another one that we're going to look at is to go campaigning. Now, because keeping with it's a bit cheesy, I'm going to keep with the coffee metaphor. So you can have an espresso or you can have an Americano. And an espresso, actually, fun trivia fact, it seems more concentrated. It actually has less caffeine than you have in a full brewed Americano, because the more the water goes over, the more that it absorbs the caffeine and passes it on. So there are two ways that you can do a campaign. We can do it in our quick way, which is we run it off of our LMS and we time it. Once person does X, then we give them Y. When they continue, they've done Y, they do Z, and I say Z because I'm Canadian, so Z. But that's how it follows through. But there's another way you can do it, possibly, and this is where I think it gets a bit interesting. Now, remember when I said to become friends with communications and marketing? Comms and marketing use tools such as, you may have heard of them, Eloqua, Marketo, HubSpot. And these are really interesting tools. So think of a time when you've gone to a particular store and you've given them your email address. What's great about that is they then put you into a campaign, whether you realize it or not. So they segment you based on whatever parameters, and then they do something that looks like this. And I really didn't want to get a high res of this because I just wanted to talk to the concepts. I didn't want to freak people out with this because it gets a little bit messy. But you're able to build campaigns. So you say, okay, after the 3 days after a person visits a store, we send them an email. If they open that email, we send them an email the next day. If they didn't open that email, we wait another 3 days and we send them a similar email, and so on and so forth. Think about running your learning campaign on a platform such as this and the type of engagement that you would get. it would be a pretty savvy thing to be able to do, because not only are you pushing out the content, but it's no longer your traditional learning curriculum where everybody does everything. You're now starting to look at what people will open. What's the click-through rate on that email? Are they interested in the title? And you can start doing some interesting work and some interesting testing. Now, one caveat is when you are working with communications and marketing, there may be some privacy issues to use employees' email addresses. So I wouldn't suggest that you just, jump in and say, "Hey, yes, I'm going to do this and see if I can use that." You have to populate it with email addresses, and to do that, you may need to get some consent. So I think the big thing to remember on here is to think about that, but also to structuring that campaign in such a way where the learner will feel like they're in more control. And when a learner feels like they're more in control, then they tend to apply things. You have the engagement there, and they tend to adopt it more. So this is just a completely different way. This is sort of the Americano, maybe more sophisticated way of looking at what a learning campaign could possibly be. And what I mocked up here is just very high level, what one could potentially look like in an actual business. So, day one, 9 a.m. for a person, we know what they're going to get, and these are the things that we feed to them. Curated articles, we ask them to install our application, we do an email introduction. And that happens at 9 a.m. because we know that's when they're going to log in. And then week 2, we start thinking about some other things that are going to happen. Poster screensaver, an Ask Me Anything session. If you haven't done one of these, this is another excellent format. I do these, or I try and do them regularly at Scotiabank, where if you're familiar with Reddit, which sometimes can be a not so nice place, so be careful what you look at there. There's just my little warning. But an Ask Me Anything session is when somebody will be online at a particular time, and you can ask them any type of question. Some famous people have done this, like Madonna, Obama, or a whole bunch of other, people, Bill Gates. We've run them where we've had our VP of Learning. And what happens is you can set a time, you do some announcing beforehand, and then people are able to comment or ask in that time. Again, that's another way to, if you have a social collaboration tool that maybe isn't getting a lot of engagement, that people aren't participating highly on, this is actually a really good way to reinvigorate people to start going to that, because you're actually doing something that's a set session. And you can use this as an effective learning tool, because you can also throw in some facts and things that you want people to know, throw in some polls, things like that. And it's something that people can go back to. So quite effective. And then here, as you see, this is just a really high level flow. Then say at month 1, this is when the app reminders start coming out. There's an e-learning module in-class event. Whatever it is that you want it to look like, this is a very broad brush, but I just wanted to give you an example. If for whatever reason you'd like to know more about some of the things that I'm talking about, I'm not endorsing any of these. I don't work with any of these companies, but there's some additional references. Eloqua University has a lot of materials that can help explain to you what actually a learning campaign is, or what a campaign is, and how to construct them, and what are some best practices. Totem by Play Consult, they are doing some very interesting things, again, with drip feeding content in this campaign sort of format. Flipe.ai and Fuse Universal. Again, I'm not. This is more personal me saying I'm interested in these topics, but these are not companies I work with. So, and the last one here is Monitor and Pivot. So the thing that a friend of mine has a really interesting job, and she's actually a pet photographer. And again, when I think back to that paparazzi thing, and she's telling me all the different things she has to do in order to get the perfect shot of a pet. And that pet can be everything from an iguana, which she has actually taken a photo of, or a dog or a cat or whatever. And different animals respond to different things. And she has a whole box of tricks of ways that she wants to get their attention. But she has to be prepared to pivot. And I think in any of our learning campaigns, we have to be, and any of these blended learning solutions, we may construct them from beginning to end what we think they should look like, but we should be monitoring the engagement all the way along, right from week 1. So the first time we push out materials, what is getting engagement, what's being ignored? And then we need to double down on that in the next day or the next week, so that we don't make the same mistakes. So what I mean by that is, say you construct something and you know what, you're not getting engagement on topic X. Rather than keep feeding that all the way through and just hoping engagement increases, you're going to need to find a way to reinvigorate that content. That may mean a different design model within your team. It may mean that you have to devote other cycles to that, because we're very much so a build once, deliver, do an ROI on it and then put it down, or get some evaluation on it and put it down. We can't always do that in the campaign, because we actually risk losing a whole bunch of time, because campaigns are quite long. So for this, it's something that I've been working with as in data-driven learning design. And in that, it's as I talked about before, you start with discovering the insights, then respond, and then monitor. So don't be afraid to do that. I really urge anybody who's investing in a blended learning campaign to design the whole thing from start to finish and have it completely locked down and have absolutely no wiggle room, because then you risk failure ultimately, because that it may not work. You may find that some things are not getting the conversation that you would like, and you don't want to be in that position. So definitely, when you're building out your project plan, after your first week launches, have some resources dedicated available so that they can go back and revise, revamp, re-engage any of those things that they need to do in order to make that blended learning experience work. So with that, that was a very, I'm close to the 45 minutes. I wanted to leave 15 minutes for questions if there are any. But again, I'm Lori Niles Hoffman. You know where you can find me on Twitter. I also have a blog there. Love to hear comments from people. I blog about a number of different things. And anything that's interest of you, please do reach out. I look forward to it.
All right, Lori, thank you so much. At this point, we will proceed to the Q&A session. Click on the Q&A icon on the right-hand side of your screen, type in your question, click submit. We're going to start with one from Ricardo. Ricardo's question is, my students get very distracted with cell phones. Do you have any suggestions for dealing with that?
Okay, I'm gonna give very high level. There's actually a really interesting icebreaker that I do to get people to put down their cell phones. This is hardly strategic, so I'll just throw this one out there. At the start of a classroom event, I hand everybody a sheet that has an empty, like just the outline of a keyboard. It doesn't have all the letters or the numbers on it. And I ask people to put away their smartphones deliberately so that they can fill in this keyboard. So it's a bit of an icebreaker, and then it gets people to put away the iPhone. I also too would consider, if you can, and I know sometimes in different environments there can be privacy issues, I would consider some ways to incorporate the phone into it. Send out, when you're thinking of that learning campaign, send it via text. There's no reason you can't do that. That's going to get their attention. I actually know of a Salesforce where they've now moved to text only. They don't even bother sending emails, because they know their salespeople, I'm going to say, typically have sort of an ADD or a very low attention span, low threshold. They know that they won't read an email, but they will read a text. So incorporate that into your classroom if you can. Don't see it as a barrier. It's always going to be there.
All right. We're going to move on to the next one from Christina. Christina's question is, out of curiosity, with classroom learning, are your learners coming to a central location for the classroom, or do you have locations spread out through Canada? Christina's asking this because they support a large retailer with over 1,000 stores across the United States.
Wow. Okay. So actually at Scotiabank, so we're not just in Canada. We're actually have a huge presence in Latin America, South America, and the Caribbean. So we have multiple locations that we do training from. And as part of an initiative currently happening at Scotiabank, we are looking at more classroom settings. So ours are definitely spread out across our geographies. And because it's impossible to have people always flying to one central location.
Okay, perfect. The next one's going to come from Jen. Jen's question is, any tips for easing a company into social platforms when they don't want to use them due to security concerns?
Okay, so I'm going to assume security concerns. If you could, well, I'll make an assumption. If it isn't, feel free, please, to clarify. Security in that it is outside of the firewall, so it's something maybe you're using like a Yammer that's not within your technical ecosystem. So for that is a tough one. I tend to then push people towards closed LinkedIn groups because you can at least limit who goes inside of them, so you know who your audience is. So it's invitation only, or it's private to viewing. So that's something that you can do. So I'm going to assume that that's the security concerns. I may have also too, if I'm wrong, I apologize, interpret that question that it could also be people's hesitancy just to put stuff out there. They're not adopting the tool because you're afraid of, making a mistake or looking foolish. And for that, that's where I again look to the influencers online. And I would also to look at some of your data, because often I started looking at some collaboration platforms and I thought engagement was very low. And what I actually found is we were a 90% or 9-to-1 ratio of lurkers versus posters. And by lurker, it's a very sinister term, but those are people who are just going online and reading, and they don't want to post. And maybe that's okay. I mean, if they're not comfortable with that, I'd love for them to be posting, but don't necessarily always look at the clicks and the likes. Also look at that number, because you may find that you actually have very viable readership. You just don't know it. And then another way, as I said, to reinvigorate engagement on a social platform is, I mentioned the AMA is a really good one. People love, I've had really good success with that one.
Awesome, thank you. And Jen did submit that. Yes, that's exactly the reason Jen was asking that. So you nailed it there.
Okay. Okay. Perfect. Perfect. Thank you, Jen.
We have one here from Tessa. Tessa's question is: I heard you say monitor and pivot. That sounds like the E in the ADDIE model, which is often skipped. How does this concept differ from the evaluate?
Okay, because it's circular. So the evaluation, and I'm not. Yes, the evaluation can often be skipped, but what I'm looking at is the evaluation almost comes up front. I look at it, it's analogous to diagnosing versus an autopsy. So if you put the E at the end, that's like it's already happened. So you're that patient's already dead, for lack of a better metaphor. By putting the evaluation up front, first of all, you're getting that diagnosis. What are the things that you think are going to work? You try the things you think are going to work. If it works, that's great. If things don't work, you have resources available to then, based on that outcome, re-engage and try something new. So it's kind of like, if you go to the doctor and say, I have a headache, and the doctor looks at you and says, yep, you look like you have a headache, doesn't take your blood pressure, do a CAT scan or any of those things, and just prescribes you some tablets. Those tablets might work, and that's great. But would you just want to have somebody look at you and say, I'm going to prescribe these tablets? So you need to be prepared to pivot. And the reason a lot of people don't pivot is, again, because they don't have the resources associated with it. So you need to ultimately change your project model from an ADDIE to, I mean, I call it data-driven learning design, but I'm obviously biased. You can call it something else or whatever you want, but it's the idea that you're allocating the resources to span across the deployment life cycle, as opposed to dropping, the developers drop off at development finishing.
All right, thank you. I have a few coming in about whether this webinar is being recorded. Yes, this webinar is recorded. Keep an eye on your email for an email from HCM Events that will contain the link to view the recording of the webinar. So also always remember to check your spam. Sometimes these auto-generated emails will be sent to spam. So again, that will come from HCM Events, and you should be able to access the recording there. We're going to move on to the next one from Umberto, and Umberto's question is: in the blending matrix, what type of trainings would you place in the other quadrants?
So for those I would definitely be looking at some of the ones that I mentioned. Sometimes it is an e-learning, right? Absolutely. But the ones that I would place in the other quadrants, actually, you know what? I'm gonna, if you mind, I take over. I'll go back to this. Can you? Oops, sorry, if you can, I just took over, Alex, sorry. If we could go back in, I can actually pull up the matrix. There it is, perfect, you've got it there. And what I was saying with the matrix is I was putting the classroom pieces over to the top left-hand corner, and that's when the skills gap is quite high and the degree of change is quite high. How I might factor it out, and I could have done a better job of this, is if I was looking at, if the degree of change is low and the skill gap is low, I'm going to probably be looking at the very simple things. That's a job aid. That's a very, tactical thing, the just-in-time type learning. If it's a high degree of change but a low skill gap, so maybe people already know how to project manage, but we're changing from, I'm going to say, a waterfall to a to agile. Okay, just for lack of a better example. That I probably would be looking at, that goes in the top right-hand quadrant. I'm going to be looking at things more that are a little bit deeper, white papers, podcasts, videos, things that are a little bit more for people to be engaged with. If we're looking at something like it's in the bottom left-hand quadrant, so the degree of change is quite low. This shouldn't be something that anyone's alarmed about or seems different, but the skill gap is quite high. So it may be something they've never encountered before. I'm probably going to be looking at, again, this would probably be where my e-learning is going to sit, pieces like that, because it's really more that I'm teaching them a new skill rather than having to change their mindset or their emotion around something or their opinion of something. So it's a bit different there.
All right, moving right along. We still have some time here. This next one comes from Danielle. Danielle's question is, how do you bring together operations and corporate employees to where they can use the same social platform?
Ooh, that's a really tough one. I think that is a tough answer. I may not be able to give an effective answer to that, mostly because I've always been in environments where all of it was together. I think what I would start to look at is, and this will be a strange answer, but bear with me. What I often do is I start looking, just go on LinkedIn and start looking to see where your company is, and you're going to probably start to find that there are rogue groups out there that you didn't know about. It might be like alumni of company ABC or something like that. And you can start to see that those are there because people will auto-generate this. I've used some of those examples as reasons to get a better hold on all of us being on one social collaboration tool. So that's because people get afraid of security issues and stuff like that. So that's kind of scaring them into doing it, which I don't really like. I think the other way is first of all, there should be cost savings. You don't want to have two platforms, and you want the synergies of people collaborating together. You can always have closed groups on any platform that you're using, whether it's a Jira or a Workplace or anything like that. So that's not a big deal. But you want these synergies. If you don't have those synergies, you don't have the diversity of thought. So I'm not sure I gave a great answer to that, but you could approach it from the security angle, and you can also approach it from the the true genuine economic one, where you're paying twice probably, and and the collaboration standpoint.
Okay, thank you for that, Lori. We're going to move on to one from Christine. Christine's question is, what is your experience with requiring learners to complete prerequisite e-learning or exercises before they come to a class, and what strategies have you employed successfully?
I've employed none successfully. So I try and avoid pre-work. There will be some people who will do it, and there's other people. So think of the modern employee. They're expected to do so much. They're expected to have so many things done. That pre-work becomes an afterthought, and I understand it, and I'm sympathetic to it. I tend to avoid it. And if you have it there and you want to have some keeners who have the time and are genuinely engaged and they're going to do it in advance, that's great. But then what I do is I make sure that my classroom event is not structured so that people who have not been able to actively engage with the pre-work lose out, meaning they're not able to engage as much as the other ones. I also too am a really big proponent of using, and I don't think we use them effectively, is the time, when people come in that very first day, that morning, and there's coffee served or whatever is out there for them. I love putting out pre-work assets then and using that time, having a video playing the second they walk in the door, things like that. And that can get everybody onto the same page. But relying on people to do pre-work, it's really tricky. You can start going down the let's make it mandatory and they have to do it in the LMS and write a test. But that also changes the tone of the classroom. So I tend to hesitate in that because you have less collaboration. So I avoid it. I actually do avoid it if I can.
Okay, perfect. We're going to go to one here from Kenny. Kenny's question is, what would you recommend for a company who's just starting to move from classroom training to either virtual training or e-module training?
First thing I would do is whatever you do, don't take your whole library and convert it all at once. Again, the understanding the digital body language, start with one or two and see how they play out. And if you're using a digital or a virtual classroom platform, you also too can get some metrics from that. You can see when people step away from their desk or their headsets. You can see what's happening on that. Look to those sorts of things, but do not do the whole thing at once. Pick strategically and plan to get those right. And that may mean that you tweak and do that pivoting, monitor and pivoting, a few cycles. But then you'll have really understood what formula or what algorithm works, and then go to the rest of your content and start applying those same things. So say you find a talking head video, didn't get engagement, don't keep building them. Try it and see. So that's the best piece of advice that I would do to anybody who's looking to digitize their library.
Okay, we have time for a couple more. We're going to go to one here from Brett. We're getting a lot of questions about the social aspects and the social platforms. So this one comes from Brett. And how have you been seeing learning professionals manage all of the social aspects of multiple programs at a time when programs are ongoing rather than the training being a single point in time occurrence with a defined start and end date?
Yeah, and that's a really tough one, and that's why I'm a big advocate that you do need to have, if you can, the learning community manager as part of as an actual headcount, like it's somebody's dedicated role. If you can't get that, and which I totally understand when it is not possible, what I've started to do with those is to put those what I've created are some KPIs on what social engagement looks like, and use those to roll up to executives. So they're now seeing the case for having it, and once they see that on their dashboard, then they're more amenable to having that time invested. It's but I guess the bigger risk is, as what I mentioned before, I know it's hard to do, but if you do have stuff going up on social and nobody's responding or managing or engaging, you actually get a negative sentiment happening and you lose your initial investment. So I would almost say, don't put it up on social if you're not able to manage that dialogue. Just find a different way, or just don't do it. Just don't have it as part of your blended.
All right, so we're going to have time for, I think, one, maybe two more. This one's going to come from Eden, and Eden's question is, in your opinion, do you think it's possible to go 100% virtual in sales training?
I've seen it done. But it has to be really high touch, and you have to have video. Definitely, there's no other way to do that. And by virtual, I'm going to assume virtual just means in distance. So you still have to have a virtual component, like a virtual classroom. I don't think you can go completely digital. So that's how I'm interpreting it. There still has to be some synchronous learning that's happening in collaboration. So no, I don't think you can just like take a bunch of modules or read these articles and be proficient. You have to have that. That's the only way that I would see it working. But it is possible. I have seen it happen.
All right. Well, Lori, that's going to be all the time we have. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. We do have a bunch of questions still in the queue, but we have all those on record. So thank you again, Lori, for that fabulous presentation. This is my second time working with you, and it's always been a pleasure. So thank you for taking the time to be with us today. I also want to thank the sponsors of today's Spotlight. As Lori mentioned, it was Cornerstone OnDemand. It's, again, also a pleasure to work with them. And I want to thank everybody for your participation and your attendance. If you enjoyed today's webinar, please take the time to fill out our post-event survey that's going to appear right as this webinar ends. Your feedback is obviously very important to us here at Chief Learning Officer Magazine. So thanks again to everybody. Thanks, Lori. Thanks, Cornerstone OnDemand. We'll see everybody back here for kind of a special event we have going on tomorrow, and starts at 2 p.m. Eastern. It's titled Digital Fluency in the Workplace. That'll be a live stream. So you can find that information on clomedia.com, and you can register there. So thanks again, everybody, and have a great day.